Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Welcome back to Messages of Necessity. I'm Ken Girardin, Research Director at the Empire Center for Public Policy. I am joined today by my saintly colleague, Bill Hammond. He is our Senior Fellow for Health Policy and very patient while we give this second take of our podcast because as Bill has been extremely patient, we haven't yet seen what's exactly in the state budget. From a financial plan perspective, we've seen the appropriation bills, we've seen the Article 7 legislation, but we have not seen how the state plans to pay for this on any kind of sustainable basis. We just have the handful of notes and numbers that have been smuggled out by brave budget officials and legislative staffers and released to the public. So at the Empire Center, we do more than just read the governor's press release to folks or the celebratory tweets from the lawmakers. So doing our best today to drill down below this opaque process. Bill and I are going to go through some of the big takeaways that we had in the state budget, which at this point is primarily just a healthcare program and schooling program that also runs some parks and paves some roads in political years. So, Bill, the biggest piece of the budget was Medicaid. I'll actually, just to frame this for folks, the budget that was approved is going to spend $235.4 billion next year. That is up from about $171 billion 6 years prior, a 36% increase. In case you were wondering if the legislature was capable of running out of other people's money to spend, the answer so far is no. But the biggest piece of that is the Medicaid program. That is the healthcare program previously for the poor and disabled, but now for actually most residents of New York City. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, it's probably back down below 50%, but yeah, it was close to half. So thank you for not saying that this was a record level of spending, although that would be technically true. They pretty much
It's a record level of
every
investment.
year, and yeah,
Investment, that's what we're supposed to call it.
but that word gets thrown around a lot at this time of year because, in fact, they do get higher every year. But that's sort of like saying I get older every year. You know, like this morning I woke up with a record high age of, So on Medicaid, the governor, I'm going to use this kind of awkward analogy, but like I feel like she's, this is her third budget. Becoming governor, becoming an actual governor there's a steep learning curve. It's kind of like learning how to drive a standard transmission, and she's developing a little bit better feel for the clutch, I feel like, in her third budget. And one sign of that is that she started out the budget season asking for a small decrease in Medicaid spending. She's presided over one of the largest increases during her first two budgets, one of the largest increases in Medicaid spending ever in its program's history. And so in her third year, she started raising an alarm about it was getting out of control, and she called for a small, it was like less than a 2% decrease. Medicaid spending still would have been much higher than it was when she took office. It would have been much higher than it was before the pandemic. It would still be higher than any other state, but she was putting the brakes on the program. At least that was her proposal. Now that the smoke is starting to clear, we get an idea of what she actually got. And essentially, she split the difference with the legislature. He was asking for a 2% decrease. They were looking for, 8 to 11% increase. It looks like, based on preliminary numbers, that what she got was a 3% increase. She asked for a 2% decrease and she got a 3% increase. That's still by much lower than her first 2 years, when it was 13% in 2023 and a 15% in 2024, and now she's getting a single-digit increase. The all funds state I shouldn't say all funds. state operating funds number for Medicaid is 37 billion. That compares to, I believe it was 26 billion just before the pandemic. So it's about 40% higher than it was heading into the pandemic in just, what is it, 5 years. That's a big increase. The all funds number we don't have yet for Medicaid, but it's going to be over 100 billion, clearly. It's been heading in that direction and flirting with that level for several years. So that's what happened with overall spending. Should I go on and talk about the rest of Medicaid? There's two other things I want to say. I would say that although she's putting on the brakes now, she's laying the groundwork for continued excessive increases in Medicaid spending. One big decision that they made this year was they enacted what they're calling an MCO tax. MCO stands for Managed Care Organizations. This is a tax on health insurance, essentially. And they're expecting it to raise ultimately $4 billion a year. So that's a lot of money even by Albany standards. That would make it one of the largest taxes that the state collects, on top of what's already about $5 or $6 billion in health insurance taxes. The difference here is that in describing what they want this tax to do, they're basically saying it's a gimmick. It's a gimmick to kind of game the federal funding system for Medicaid and to draw down federal aid as revenue without actually, normally the way Medicaid works is the state spends $1 and the federal government matches it with $1 plus. This tax would allow them to get the federal government to pay the matching funds without the state putting in anything. That's what they say they want to do. They're following the lead of California, which successfully did this. The thing is that this game that they're playing it flies in the spirit of federal law, which federal law does not want states to be doing this tax scheme. California figured out this kind of clever way to game the system, to develop a tax with a lot of elaborate details that would narrowly pass a statistical test that the federal government uses in this situation. And so New York lawmakers are like, "Oh, that's a good trick. Let's imitate that before the federal government closes it down." That's what they said they wanted to do. They said they wanted to follow California, but what they actually put into law is just very vague. It says the health commissioner should enter negotiations with the federal government. It should figure out a tax, and then it should start collecting the tax. It doesn't say what the dollar amounts are. It doesn't say what the rates are. It doesn't say exactly who's going to pay it and who's not going to pay it. It's very open-ended. It has no sell-by date, right? Like no expiration date. The health commissioner, if he wanted to, he could make the tax $8 billion instead of $4 billion. He could collect it from all health insurance companies instead of trying to target it to Medicaid. I think that's a very dangerous law to have on the books, especially since the early indications are that the federal government is not going to let us do what California did. And so the state's going to want that $4 billion. It might have to do a tax that's not zeroing in on Medicaid and that actually affects average consumers and makes their health insurance even more expensive.
And the real danger is, as I see it, is, having read your work on this, is that the state goes ahead, lets Medicaid swell another $4 billion, and when they eventually run out of runway, if we can throw in yet another metaphor into this conversation, they'll have to turn back to taxing New York health plans, not just that free money from Washington. Because
so I actually think if you look back at the arc of this year's budget, it started in November and December with the healthcare industry clamoring for a gigantic increase in spending, the equivalent of a 40% increase in spending. They were saying there's a 30% gap, and if you close the gap, that's a 40% increase. And I think their ultimate goal was to lock in a rate increase. And so the question was, where's the money going to come from? This MCO tax was their solution, which they kind of held back. It didn't become public that they were considering this until mid-March. It's kind of the closing weeks of, or what should be the closing weeks of the budget negotiations. They never gave any details about how it would work. To this day, they haven't given details because they just put in this kind of placeholder legislation. But they also agreed to rate increases. What the industry is framing as a kind of a down payment towards the big rate increases they wanted. Once those rate increases are approved, and once the industry has become accustomed to them and they've built their whole financial operations around these rate increases, it's going to be very difficult for the state to pull them back. So if this tax gimmick that they're doing doesn't pan out, they're still going to be under pressure to come up with that revenue from somewhere, whether it's a tax on health insurance or a tax on the wealthy or whatever. It's going to add to the pressure on the legislature and the governor to agree to some big revenue increase to finance those rate increases once they're locked in. So I think that was where the money comes from. The industry doesn't actually doesn't care about that. What they care about is having the money flow in their direction, and they got that. They got $700 or $800 million in rate increases for hospitals and nursing homes. They're a little bit vague about how they're going to work, but they're on the books. They're in law, and once that money starts flowing, it's difficult to stop.
And I'm glad you talked about the MCO tax because we can joke about the size of the state budget. The real problem that comes with that size is the sustainability of it all. So besides counting on $4 billion that may or may not continue coming in on any kind of reliable recurring basis, the state is more reliant than ever on capital gains and its top earners because of the temporary income taxes that were imposed in 2021, which had the effect of giving New York City the highest combined top state and local income tax rate in the country. And we are, as we've seen in the past in 2001, as we saw especially in 2007, 2008, 2009, those income tax receipts from the top earners attached to Wall Street can evaporate seemingly overnight. The capital gains realizations in New York dropped 75% between 2007 and 2009. And that's where we're getting a really big share of the personal income tax receipts. So between the MCO tax that may not turn up and the personal income tax receipts that are notoriously volatile, we could have a pretty bumpy road within the next 12 to 24 months, depending on how Wall Street does.
I think I should underline who pays the MCO tax. I mean, if they do it the way California did it, it's the federal government paying the MCO tax. It's essentially a tax on the federal government, which means it's a tax on the whole country. The other, New York and the other 49 states would collectively pay that tax. But if it doesn't pan out the way California's did, and that's the early signals from CMS, is they're not going to let us do the California plan, or they're reluctant to let us do it. If you tax health insurance without that gimmick, it's a tax on everybody who has health insurance.
Right.
It's a tax on the employers who have health benefits. It's a tax on the employees who contribute towards those health benefits. It makes those health benefits more expensive, which basically comes out of your compensation as an employee. New York already taxes health insurance to the tune of about $400 per person, or $1,600 for a family of four. This MCO tax would add to that. It would add to the high cost of health insurance in New York State. So you were mentioning the volatility of taxes on high income people. A health insurance tax is rock steady. It because it has kind of a captive audience.
Right.
Employers are reluctant to cancel their health plans no matter how expensive they get. What they might do though is run up your deductibles and your copays and the share of the premium that the employee has to pay if their costs go up dramatically.
Well, and similarly, if we can jump over to another big part of the budget, what we've seen historically, whenever school aid has inevitably had to go down because of volatility in the state's tax receipts, those costs don't just disappear at the local level; they get shifted over to property taxpayers. So if I could distill this down a little bit, looking at the roughly 55% of the state budget that's going to go to those two places, the people who should be most concerned watching the kind of precariously balanced state budget are the people who'd be hit by health insurance taxes and the people who would be hit by property tax increases, which is 100% of New York. But on the on the school aid side of things, we saw the governor also tried to tap the brakes on the growth of school aid at the start of this process. It was really encouraging to see a governor out there saying we have the highest per pupil spending in the nation, because that's kind of something that just doesn't get brought up in polite Albany society, because it would hurt the teachers unions feelings. It would hurt we just call them collectively the school people, who are constantly clamoring for more aid without any kind of commensurate increase in accountability or, heaven forbid, measurement of their outputs. So the governor tried to tap the brakes on that. She tried to do two big things. One was to change the inflation rate factor that was used to calculate how school aid increases automatically. And the other one, which was arguably even much more important, was a change to the state's save harmless provision, which essentially required the state to ignore decreases in enrollment as they were doling out aid and ensure that school districts never got less money than they did before. And we've got school districts that, a number of school districts that have had enrollment drop by more than 10% in a decade. And the foundation aid formula uses enrollment figures going back, I believe, to the early 2000s. So you've got districts that could have had more than 20% enrollment drops, and the state was having to fund these imaginary students. And I'll accept the premises of what a lot of other, some other school districts are saying about them having needs. Those alleged needs were getting unmet because the state was being forced to fill classrooms in empty, wealthy school districts. I should say, fill empty classrooms in wealthy suburban school districts rather than retarget the aid. So the governor tried to take that on. She was successful on tweaking the inflation formula. The legislature fought back tooth and nail to prevent Save Harmless from going away. And school aid has jumped by over $1 billion more than last year to now, I believe, about $36 billion. And taken together with Medicaid, just looking at what we call state operating funds, that is the money that Albany needs to collect in New York through taxes to fund the budget. It doesn't include federal aid, it doesn't include borrowed money, but more than half of that money is going to Medicaid and to school aid now, which is why I joke about the state budget being a Medicaid and school aid program that also does a handful of other things.
That safe harmless thing. There's a lot of talk in education policy circles in New York about equity and about the disparities in per pupil funding between districts. And the foundation formula is meant to correct that. It's meant to, analyze need, analyze, the ability of property taxpayers to finance the schools and adjust the state aid based on need. If you continue with hold harmless, you are blowing that up because the money is not following the students. It's not following the need. The formula is being kind of tossed out the window for those school districts. And the thing is, the people who fought for that formula, who literally, went to court and one court rulings that led to the creation of that formula are pretty much silent when it comes to the continuation of hold harmless, because really what they want is not, they're not so much dedicated to equity, they're just dedicated to leveling everybody up. And so if hold harmless perpetuates inequity, that gives you an argument to increase funding for the other districts. It's like a self-reinforcing cycle.
And as we're recording this, just speaking to where that reinforcing cycle goes, the state of New York's per pupil school spending in school year 21-22, so before, at the beginning of the current school aid binge, not even midway, but at the beginning of the current school aid binge, was $29,873 per student. Almost double the national average, and probably more importantly, 36% more than that backwards red state underfunding Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
This is
So,
something that our colleague E.J. McMahon just blogged about on our website, empire.center.org. So people can look that up. And it's an impressive, the red line at the top of the chart, which is showing New York's curve, it has the steepest slope I've ever seen in the last year. It's really, I'm accustomed to seeing New York's spending be well above the national average, but to see how much wider it got just in that 1 year. And that's partly because of more spending. It's also partly because our enrollment's going down. Our overall population is kind of stagnant, and our public school enrollment is dropping pretty precipitously.
and Bill, in my enthusiasm to talk about school aid going to the moon, I failed to let you talk about one of the major cost drivers with Medicaid, where you've been you have been the chief watchdog on the state's personal care spending through Medicaid, which Governor Hochul also seems to be apt to try to bring under control. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so personal care is what we should emphasize. This is non-medical services provided to people who are, it's supposed to be provided to people who are disabled, and it's an alternative to putting them in nursing homes, at least in theory. Is that you send someone, a kind of general helper, a personal care aide, into their home, and that helper can help them with really basic things like bathing and going to the bathroom, but also eating, and in some cases like housekeeping, keeping the home in a livable condition, shopping. And people, depending on their level of disability, are entitled to different levels of hours. And then there's a program called consumer directed personal care, where the person isn't, the care aide isn't sent in by an agency. The care aide is somebody that the patient recruits, trains, and manages directly. And this can be a friend or a family member. And so that program, that piece of home care called consumer directed personal assistance, has exploded in the last decade. I think one number that the budget director was putting out was a 1,200% increase in spending over a period of, I forget how many years, but it's hard to exaggerate how quickly that program has expanded. And so the governor, I feel like this problem was sort of getting a little bit of lip service. The governor came in this budget with a proposal, another kind of last minute proposal that emerged during the behind closed doors talks. Let's consolidate that program. It's the people who are actually managing the caregivers don't have the capacity to they don't have the capacity to manage a payroll. The state is paying the caregivers through Medicaid, and they use these companies called fiscal intermediaries. We're supposed to really just be a go-between. Medicaid pays them, they pay the caregiver, and they take a fee for their work. the state has seen that industry, the fiscal intermediary industry, explode. There's now hundreds of them, that most of them created in the last 8 to 10 years. And she's like, no, that's wasteful. We don't need hundreds of those programs. Some states only have one. Let's just have a single fiscal intermediary for the whole state. And we'll have a few companies that subcontract with that single fiscal intermediary. And that'll help us to kind of get our arms around the program, regulate it better. We'll have some economies of scale, maybe. And so she's saying that by doing that, switching to a single fiscal intermediary, the state will save, Medicaid will save like $500 million. About 200 million of that will be state savings. That's an enormously difficult thing to pull off. And her deadline is January 1 of 2025. After that, technically, only one company is allowed to be a fiscal intermediary. He's got to do an RFP. He's got to, accept applications, review the applications, sign a contract. Those are all. Each of those steps is weeks, if not months, long process. It's going to be very challenging for her to get this together by January 1. She's also likely to face litigation from all the companies that are being basically forced out of business. There are hundreds of them. They're very well organized. They've contributed money to lobbying groups that have had some success getting their way in Albany. So she's going to face a fight there. I think you're already seeing evidence of that. I guess another concern that arises, I guess I see the logic of streamlining the program, centralizing it, making it easier to control, getting economies of scale. But another thing that this does is you have a single company that employs that has a role in employing tens of thousands of workers, if not hundreds of thousands of workers. It seems to me that will set up the possibility of unionization for that program. And one of the biggest and most influential lobbying organizations in Albany is 1199, the healthcare union. They were, as I understand it, they were among the chief proponents of this plan. And so if you get unionization of those workers, that's going to drive higher costs. The workers would start paying dues to the union, so that would come out of their paychecks. And that's kind of interesting that like a mother who's taking care of her disabled son would need union representation in that situation. Or actually more common would be a daughter taking care of a disabled parent. What's the union's role in arbitrating between a mother and her parent?
Can you imagine those grievances?
I can see the union representing the workers in negotiations with the state over wages. The thing is, the state already manages those wages and has been pushing them up and pushing them up. I guess I would think that it would be wise for the state to kind of rule out that possibility, to say correctly that the fiscal intermediaries are not the actual employer, that the legal employer is the patient. That's the whole idea of consumer-directed patient personal assistance. So that's another iceberg down the road. The MCO tax is a potential cost driver, and also the possibility of unionization of a whole swath of home care workers.
So let's see if we haven't ticked up everybody's anxiety level about the high enough yet. What else did you see in there that makes you worry about the state's trajectory? For me, it was this increasingly constant state presence in the childcare sector. The state, prior to the state budget, was spending, in one form or another, we'll say roughly 400 million per year, depending on how you measured it. The state had a tax credit for childcare, which was mostly crafted as something that state lawmakers could go brag to suburban voters about in election years. that number, that spending spiked because there was some temporary pandemic aid that was used to for childcare worker retention. And now the governor seems to be looking to get the state, on a constant spending level north of $1 billion on childcare. And I could see that still going even higher because the state isn't addressing the fundamental cost drivers. So it's small now, but it has the chance to mushroom just the same way these Medicaid programs have, just the same way the state's involvement in school aid has. I mean, to put things in context for folks, the per pupil school aid from in Cuomo's first budget passed in 2011 was about $7,500 per student, and it's now close to $15,000 per student. Even with inflation, that's a pretty huge jump. And Bill, as you mentioned, with the unions and other folks who are invested in keeping Medicaid spending levels high, what you have are these massive permanent constituencies that are now responsible for more than half of the state budget and don't want to give an inch, basically, on that, on their hard fought spending levels that they've won. And that has the potential to have a major crowding out effect on the sorts of smaller but really important things that state government is counted on to do.
Yeah, you mentioned childcare. I feel like there's kind of cognitive dissonance in that area because the whole concept of childcare is that the parent doesn't want to do that work. In other words, the parent feels like there's something they want to do with their time that's more valuable than taking care of their children. And for some parents, that makes perfect sense, right? They have a job that earns them a lot of money. If they can outsource the childcare for part of the day, it makes sense economically for them. The tricky thing, though, is the more expensive you make childcare, the fewer people can make that economics work. And when the state gets involved in childcare, it inevitably pushes up the cost. It starts setting standards, safety standards, training standards. It also starts, you see this in a lot, I don't know if they've done it in childcare yet, but they do it all over the place in healthcare. They set a minimum wage or a living wage. They start mandating benefits. And all of those things increase the cost of the childcare, which limits how many people it makes economic sense for them to use childcare in the first place. And the state's response to that is, well, let's subsidize childcare. And subsidizing, it already does quite a lot of that. Subsidizing also pushes up, just sort of through the laws of economics. It makes anything that's subsidized naturally gets more expensive. And so there's kind of there's a similar dynamic with home care. A lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it is replacing informal stuff that was done by family members. If the family member was paying for it directly, they would do a kind of cost benefit analysis. Is it worth it to me to pay somebody else to do this work? When it's the state paying, there's no need to do cost benefit analysis. Of course you want to outsource it. And that leads to overuse.
That is a big part of what's helped us get to the highest per capita Medicaid spending in the nation, which is now what is every New York? What is the total spending on Medicaid on a per resident basis? Like every.
I mean, I don't have that number at the tip of my fingers. I know that it's close. It's well above the national average and higher than any other state. I could look it up.
I think it was over $2,000 per resident the last time I looked at your stuff. Bill's, if you're not already reading Bill's stuff and following him on Twitter, he's at NY Hammond, and subscribing for his email updates. I strongly recommend people do it.
And you are at Policy Engineer.
I was not looking for a plug. I was not looking for a plug. I was looking for people to go and pull up that per capita Medicaid spending article themselves.
And also, all of our work is at empirecenter.org in one way or another.
This is a perfect point to wrap up before we take people any further into our standard boilerplate disclaimers on the end of the show. So, Bill, thank you for all the work you did through the budget, keeping people on top of keeping people apprised of the MCO tax. You sounded the alarm on it in a really good Wall Street Journal editorial that folks should read. But thank you all for listening. Thank you for your support of the Empire Center. And until the next time we have something terrible from Albany to tell you about, podcast adjourned.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.